Now that I've placed the steering shaft with the worm gear on it up inside the housing, I'm going to prepare to put the adjustable end cap on. In order to make sure that this thing doesn't leak, I want to use a good quality thread sealant, which is capable of that temperature that will be applied to this thing while it's running down the road next to the engine. And this sealant right here is capable of over 400 degrees. And so I've used this for many years. I put it generously on the threads of the adjuster cap. I don't care if I put a little too much on because I want to make sure that it seals. I place the roller bearing in the race, put a little 90 weight grease on the rollers so that they start out with lubrication on them. I carefully place the roller bearings on the end of the worm gear shaft and turn it in by hand while I'm rotating the worm gear inside of the housing. If it binds up, you have to jiggle it and try again, because what's happening is one of the bearings will jump out of the race. So you jiggle it and turn it, and you go most of the way in with this. If you'll notice, it's almost all the way in. Now it's getting to where it's hard to turn. This is about where it needs to be. I can still turn it by hand. It's time now to put the lock nut on, the big lock ring on. The lock ring has a kind of a flat face and a curvy face. The flat face goes up against the housing. Just thread that on. We're not going to tighten it yet because we're not through adjusting it, but we just want to start it on the threads. There it is, a turn or so on. Now we're going to place a steering wheel on the upper end of the shaft. Place it on in any position you want and spin it around to spread the oil around the roller bearings. And tighten the adjusting nut a little bit. By hand, you begin to feel it's tightening up a little tiny bit. We're going to grab our crescent wrench here and tighten it up just slightly. And then we're going to measure the tension on the steering wheel with a little, what you might call a fish scale. This is a weird little shaped one, but you can buy these at any good sporting goods place where they sell fishing gear that weighs in ounces. And we want to be somewhere under, 50 ounces. Because we're going to be working between 6 and 12 ounces for this adjustment right here. And then later, the next adjustment we're going to do in a few minutes is going to be between 16 and 32 ounces. Or I think it's 16 and 30 ounces. So I have the little measurements marked on here with a felt pen, just so I don't have to read the numbers. It's easy to see the little felt pen marks. And you hook the scale to a spoke of the steering wheel in accordance with the instructions from the factory, and then pull the steering wheel through and read the resistance to turning. The resistance to turning, and it's supposed to come somewhere down here between 6 and 12 ounces of pull to keep the wheel turning, and that's exactly what we have right now. We'll have about 8 ounces. So it's time to tighten the lock ring and see if our adjustment stays true after we tighten the lock ring up. I'm going to get a hammer and the punch, and we're going to tighten the lock ring. Perfect. That's great. It's staying right within the adjustment range. It's set. It's right on the money. So what I've done here is I've adjusted the bearings that support the steering shaft, preloaded the two bearings, one here in the cap and one here in the upper end of the case, preloaded those with a little bit of preload. In other words, there's no play, there's no movement. They're locked into position with a certain amount of preload on them, and they're allowed to turn, but there's no lateral or axial movement in that shaft or the worm gear at all. It's only allowed to turn in circles. And once again, you can feel how smooth it is up here, and turn it around and around. There's no catches or binding in it in any way. I'm going to wipe off the excess material that I used to seal the threads, just to get it kind of cleaned up. Later on, they're going to paint this, so they could paint right over the end of here the way I've left it. So we have now also, as you remember, faced this with the single cut mill file to make sure that it's nice and smooth. And now I'm going to clean the threads in here once again with brake clean and a little compressed air, because I want to make sure that when I seal those threads in the 4 attachment bolts that the sealant will adhere, because it will not adhere if there's any petroleum solvents or any residue of grease or oil in there. That's pretty good. That's nice and clean and dry. I'm going to now take the cover bolts for the side cover, and I want to clean them with that same material as well, because I want them to be dead clean so that the sealant will adhere to them. So now I have, after having flat filed the side cover and put the needle bearings in place, I have placed some RTV blue. You can use different kinds of sealant. I use room temperature vulcanizing, high temperature gasket sealant. I place a thin coating of it over the cast iron side cover, push the gasket into the material, and put a little tiny bit more on the gasket. It doesn't have to be thick, just a tiny little bit of a surface covering of it, so that it doesn't have any way of leaking. We don't want any leaking of the material, because that's what actually caused the steering gearbox to go bad in the first place, was that eventually it becomes dry inside. People don't often think about lubricating and filling up the steering gearbox on these old cars, so they became dry, and they sat dry for many years, and then the air that was in there carried moisture, and the moisture created little droplets of specks of rust. And those little specks of rust created the beginnings of the galling that ruins the face of the worm gear and the bearings and so forth. So it's very important to keep it lubricated properly inside. And now I have spread a thin coating of this stuff over the gasket. I'm now going to put the adjustable I'm going to put the sector shaft through, putting a little bit of oil on it, a little bit of 90 weight grease, and then we're going to prepare this with some sealant on the adjustment shaft as well. So we take a little bit of 90 weight, put it on the sector shaft. This way we'll lubricate the needle bearings, which I've already shot a little bit on there, I think, or I will right now, and also the seal. Make sure that the seal, the rubber oil seal, has a little bit of lubrication on it. So I'll shoot a little tiny bit in the end of the housing right here and spread it around. That'll protect the seal and lubricate the seal. And now the sector shaft will go in this side, straight in and straight up. I've already put some 90 weight grease on the ball bearings, straight across, and I operate it through the needle bearings and the seal on the other side. And you might have to turn the steering wheel just slightly to enable it to go in straight. And there it is. It's in place, ready for the side cover. Okay, now we've put the sector shaft in. Steering wheel is straight. Sector roller is straight up on the top of the keyway. We're going to put some thread sealant material on the threads of the adjuster bolt, so that the adjuster screw here, so that it won't leak oil through this. Seems like oil can leak anywhere that you don't think of. So we'll put a little bit of the thread sealant, any kind you want that's able to withstand the temperature, on the threads of this thing. And they'll stop the liquid from going out the side cover there. Now, using a screwdriver, we take the end cover with our gasket affixed to it. We reach through and turn the screw counterclockwise and draw the side cover into place. And we go all the way in. And we want to make sure that we go all the way in to where the side cover is flush against the side of the steering gear box before we put the bolts in the four corners. Because what we don't want to do is to draw the bolts tight up against here and jam the roller into the worm gear, damaging it. So in this case, we're real close. We have the adjuster nut all the way out, and we're still not all the way home with the side cover. So what I'm going to do is turn the steering wheel a little bit off of center. That will, remember we talked about the steering gear being a hourglass worm gear, and the center of its travel encountered some resistance. Well, we want to make sure that when we tighten these four cover bolts, that we're not jamming the roller into the worm gear at that point of resistance. So I'm going to go up here and turn the steering wheel just about a half a turn, and then I will be able to make sure that the side cover goes all the way home there without jamming the roller into the worm gear. So now we put a little bit of thread material on the side cover screws. Okay, so sealing up all these bolts and then putting them in and putting a little torque wrench on there at about 12 foot-pounds of torque. Is all you need. Remember, we have nice flat surfaces now that were burnished with a file, and we have thread sealing compound, and all the screws around the edge are sealed, and so is this one, so is the end cover, so it should be pretty well sealed up now. I don't believe it'll leak.